Okay, welcome back. In our last screencast, we focused in on the meaning behind social cultural learning theory, and we got an introduction into the zone of proximal development. What is the basic definition of it? And so I think with this one, I want to really focus in on how it works. And so basically, we just go to a review of what social cultural learning theory does. We need to remember the importance of language and speech. In the case of reading and mathematics, or really any content area, language plays a central role in the learning of those or any of those concepts or content areas. To understand those concepts, you need language, and you need to be in a community that uses those content areas. So if it's social studies, you need to be in a community where history or political science or economy or geography is being used. There is no incentive to riding a bike if bicycling is not a prominent feature in your society. But if it is, there is much language and speech associated with it. The same is true with reading, mathematics, social studies, history, science, biology, chemistry. There's always some kind of community that you can find. Those concepts and activities associated have vocabulary and syntax and discourse associated with it. To learn them requires being embedded in that language and to use it and to hear it. Furthermore, the learner must be supported in the development of that language through speech. Being in the zone of proximal development means that the learner and the advanced other, that is the tutor or the teacher, must be interacting with the learner. They must be interacting with each other. Language must be used by both. Another reason why zone of proximal development works is because of scaffolding. This term is something Vygotsky did not necessarily construct on his own. It came later from Jerome Bruner, who is 100 years old this year, and he's still alive. But Jerome Bruner and his associates did an investigation of moms and their toddlers and how the moms supported their children playing a particular game. What Bruner and his associates found was that when babies couldn't solve the problem on their own, that is, they were working with blocks and trying to stack the blocks in a particular way, the parent would support their child's thinking. So while the child was in the zone of proximal development, the place where they couldn't do it independently, the parent provided much needed support in order to enable the toddler to be successful. This support was they called it scaffolding. The parent, or not the parents called it, but the researchers, Bruner and his associates, called it scaffolding. The parent provided scaffolding in the form of modeling, questions, and explicit instruction. When the child needed a lot of support, the parent scaffolded with explicit instruction or direct instruction and modeling. As the child needed less support, the parent scaffolded with strategic questions. These questions serve to assess what the child could do and to guide students' thinking where they thought that they couldn't understand or couldn't think through the problem. In short, while a child is in the zone of proximal development, there must be substantial interactive speech making by both parties. The child must be talking through his or her thinking so that the advanced learner can provide the relevant and needed scaffolds. The learner and the adult make meaning together so that the concept or the learning goal can be eventually internalized by the learner. And the two must do this with repeated practice, so it takes time. In the classroom, scaffolds come in many forms. They can be anything that provides support to a child on a task. Some example scaffolds in a high school classroom um, our, um, our, our glossaries, visuals, posters, notes, crib sheets, whatever you can find, you may want to use that in the classroom as scaffolds. Sentence frames also is an example. But the most important scaffold is the teacher's questions. The teacher must be willing to get scaffold students by asking strategic questions. These questions are informal assessments. They guide learners' thinking. They are relevant for specific needs, and they are faded away over time. So questions like these: what do you remember about the character? What are the steps to adding mixed fractions? And what do you think inference means in this context? These are questions that are guiding students' thinking to help solve the particular problem. So I put this in here because I really want you to think about, why is it called scaffolds? Why did Brunner and his associates decide to call it scaffold? And I think I want you to just contemplate this picture for a moment and think about why it was called scaffold. How does this sort of relate to how students learn and what's going on? So we'll talk about that in class on Monday. It is also important for you to know the difference between scaffolds and tools. So in past screencasts, I've talked about tools already. I've talked about language as a tool. So it's important to know the difference between a scaffold and a tool. Many teachers confuse tools as scaffolds. They overuse the word scaffolds. They want to use the word to represent any time they help students. But in reality, it is a specific help with tools that are faded away because the learner internalizes those tools into their cognitive processes. It becomes their inner speech. So in other words, the scaffolds are temporary tools that need to be faded away over time. And these tools become internalized. They are a part of students or the learner's inner speech. Notice how math manipulatives is a scaffold. We use them, so basically I've listed what I think are scaffolds and what are tools. Math manipulatives are considered a scaffold because we may use them to count when we're first learning how to count and learning our numbers, but when we can do this independently, we no longer need the manipulatives. Tools are things that we need all the time, like microwave ovens. I basically, by using it, don't learn how to cook any better to the point where I don't need microwave ovens. I use it. It's a tool that helps me get cooking done very quickly and efficiently. Same thing with these other things: computers, forks and knives, pens and paper, hammers, nails, dictionary. These are things that are tools, but it can also be a scaffold depending on how you use it. I put these two here, measuring cups and maps. I want you to think about whether or not they're tools or scaffolds. Come to class with some ideas about whether or not measuring cups are tools or are they scaffolds. And the same thing with maps. All right. I want to talk about zone proximal development and scaffolding applied to lesson planning. The gradual release model by Pearson and Gallagher is based on Vygotsky and Brunner's ideas about learning. They constructed a lesson plan model that suggests that learners need a lot of assistance at the beginning of a lesson, so direct instruction and modeling are needed. But as students gain some independence, they need less support. Eventually, they can do the task independently. This is true, but this seldom happens within one lesson. So to construct a 50-minute or 90-minute lesson with this I do, we do, you do together, you do alone structure seems, in my opinion, unrealistic. I also want you to think about the fact that your students, our students, are diverse. Some students come into the classroom being able to do more things independently. Other students less so. So if I treated everybody the same and decided that I needed to model this, a particular thing for everyone, then I'm wasting some students' time. If I decide that I needed to scaffold everyone in the same way, then I'm wasting some students' time. I'm not developing their particular skills. So the big takeaway from this is that we need to find opportunities for learners to be active and using language to make sense of the content you are teaching at high school. So what we should be doing in our main instruction is really provide guided practice. We should find a place in our lessons that allow learners to be active and make mistakes and need and use scaffolds in order to be successful. Teachers should provide scaffolding questions during the main instruction that assess whether students are gaining in their ability to independently do the task. When students cannot, which, hey, they shouldn't, they will over time, but we can't expect them to do it from the start. We need to assess. We need to provide relevant tools to extend students' thinking, and we need to give students opportunities to share their thoughts and to practice these skills. So my take is that however you want to structure your main instruction, just try to find opportunities for you to ask these two questions, or to scaffold in these two ways. Scaffolding questions that check for understanding and focus attention, and provide scaffolding tools that allow students to practice the particular skill so that they can eventually, you can eventually remove those tools, those scaffolds, so they don't need them anymore. All right, so we've talked about zone approximal development and scaffolding. I want to leave you with an idea, a little notion about distributed cognition, and I'm going to do this very quickly. Last week I stated that social cultural learning theory suggests that knowledge and thinking doesn't exist within one person. Knowledge and thinking of abstract concepts is shared between the learner, the advanced learner, and the environment. Abstract concepts had to be socially constructed so that the ideas are shared among individuals. Language mediates our thinking, right? We remember all of this, right? So over time, an individual internalizes the concept in their own and unique way. Thus, thinking must traverse external to inner and back to external spaces. We all traverse these external and inner spaces. As such, our thinking is said by Edwin Hutchins to be distributed. That is, we engage in distributed cognition. Our thinking is not our own. It belongs to the shared social and cultural spaces. Thinking is shared among people, tools, and language. So our thinking, which is the cognition part, is distributed among these ideas: people, tools, and language. Consider the following example. Let's say that I'm baking cookies for my family. Then I learned that my sister and her family, or their families, want to join me. So I'm now having to double the portions. But what is 2 times 3/4 cups of flour? Well, how do I figure this out? So there are 3 possible strategies, or at least I'm going to share with you 3. There's probably tons more, but there are 3 possible strategies. I can use the strategy taught by my 5th grade teacher. I could use the internet to figure out how to, what 2 times 3/4 cups flour is. Or I can just use the cup measure twice. So I don't actually have to figure out the actual number, but I get the quantity, and I'm using a particular tool to allow me to do so. So in a sense, my thinking is really distributed among one or more of these ways, possible strategies. My fifth grade teacher, the internet, or the tool that I'm using. But let's say that I designed my own method of figuring out how to double the portions. My own method was distributed among my understanding and thinking of others that have supported me. My new way takes bits and pieces of what others have shared with me. My thinking is still distributed in part among what I have, my experiences. So, what is the implication of distributed cognition for the classroom? Can it explain small group work, why we might want to do small group work? Can it explain technology in the classroom, why we have computers or having kids use iPads or using the Promethean board? Can it explain calculator use? Can it explain manipulatives? Can it explain lesson plans, why teachers use lesson plans at all? So these are some really interesting things to consider about distributed cognition. In class on Monday, we are going to continue working on our projects where I want you to continue to make meaning of Vygotsky's learning theory. But I want you to bring 3 things with you. I want you to be sure to bring examples of how you work with students who are in the zone of proximal development. I want you to bring examples of scaffolds you use in your subject. So I want you to think about some of these scaffolds, and I want you to be able to determine whether or not they are scaffolds or not. So this is in part similar to the activity that I stated earlier in the screencast about whether or not measuring cups or maps are scaffolds or tools or both. And I want you to bring a lesson plan that you have taught or that you will teach, but I want you to bring that in class. So my goal is to try to get you to be thinking about these concepts in light of your own lesson plan. All right, thank you for listening. I'll see you in class on Monday. Bye-bye.